afternoon, and hello, Daniel. Nice to meet you. Good afternoon, the audience. My name is Wang, working in the Sinica, as you just heard. It's my great pleasure to be here to be chairing this session, talking about this really interesting question about knowledge being artificial or artifactual. Right? Artifactual is what Daniel was trying to get at. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Smith to you, who has received a PhD from the University of Chicago and was primarily in continental philosophy. He is, as you know, a very well-known scholar in Deleuze studies and various other continental philosophers. He is the author of Essays on Deleuze, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2012, and the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Deleuze, co-edited with Henry Simon Hall, also published in 2012, and has translated from French books by Gilles Deleuze, Pierre Kolosowski, Isabelle Stanger, and Michel Safet. He is also the co-director of the Deleuze Seminar Project, which is translating Deleuze seminars lectures, and which actually received generous grants from the National Endowment of Humanities. So without further ado, I know we only have about an hour, so we want to give as much time to the speaker, and then hopefully we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A. So let's have a round of applause to welcome Professor Daniel Smith.
Thank you, Andy, for that kind introduction, and thanks to Sebastian and the team for this wonderful conference. So the question I want to consider today is knowledge artifactual. So I'm not very, for a technology conference, I'm not very technologically astute, so hopefully I can get my PowerPoint working. So the question I want to consider today is knowledge artifactual? I first came across this question in a book called Knowledge and Civilization, by a great and underappreciated Canadian philosopher named Barry Allen, who was a student of Richard Rorty. When Deleuze says that philosophers create concepts, he is essentially saying that concepts are artifacts that have to be fabricated. But linking philosophy to techniques in this manner is a rather minor tradition in Western thought. It was the Greeks who famously denigrated techne, or techniques, in favor of episteme, knowledge. And philosophy generally holds that knowledge is ensconced not in artifacts, but rather in statements or propositions. And indeed, many philosophers hold that language is itself the medium of thought. And we could give numerous examples where philosophy focused on the analysis of statements. Kant proudly derived his 12 a priori categories from different types of judgments or statements. Michel Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge is, in its entirety, an examination of statements, what statements can or cannot be said in a given epistemic formation. And analytic philosophy itself was born out of what Richard Rorty called a linguistic turn that led it to focus almost exclusively on language and the analysis of propositions. So the aim of my talk is largely to swim against this current somewhat and to suggest first that technicity is a more profound medium of thought than language. In other words, that knowledge and truth are artifactual, like an automobile is a mode of knowledge. And second, that if we think through language, it's because the way we understand language is itself deeply rooted in technicity. And that's the deeper point I want to explore today. So first, knowledge as artifactual. Let me start by giving a few examples of obvious examples of what might be considered to be artifactual knowledge. Some people at the camp talked a little bit about this yesterday, so it might be a little bit of a repeat. It's often said that in the modern world there have been 3 ages of machines: mechanical machines like watches, energetic machines like the steam engine and motor cars, and finally informational machines like computers and smartphones. Now, each of these types of machines, in turn, has been used as a model to interpret nature as a whole or objects within nature. In the 17th century, the idea of mechanism arose in part from an analogy with mechanical machines like the watch. The world is like a watch with internal mechanisms that explain its functioning, what came to be known as the clockwork universe. Animals, according to Descartes and Lemaitre, were themselves nothing but pieces of machinery. And just as a watch needs a watchmaker, the deist argued, so the world needs a creator, a fabricator. Mechanism quickly invaded physics, biology, and even theology. The same thing happened in the 18th and 19th centuries when the world started to be interpreted in terms of energetic machines, which spawned what Toynbee, I believe, was the first to call the Industrial Revolution. The entire science of thermodynamics developed out of efforts to understand the workings of steam engines and to make them more efficient. The world was now understood in terms of energy, and because of entropy, the world was going to end, quote, not with a bang, but with a whimper. That's T.S. Eliot's famous phrase from his poem, The Hollow Man. Humans themselves, in the theory of labor, came to be seen as work-producing engines, work that Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor quantified in order to make them more efficient. The 20th century ushered us into what is called now the information age that we're in the middle of, following developments of the telegraph, telephone, radio, television, and ultimately computers and the internet. Today, information machines are often seen as models for the mind. The brain is the hardware and the mind is the software running different programs in different modules. Thinkers as diverse as Michel Serres and Luciano Floridi now see the operations of receiving, stocking, treating, and transmitting information as the basic features of all objects, whether they are living or inert. Now, for a long time when I started this project, these analogies seemed to me to follow an impossibly inverted logic. We invent a technology, watches, engines, computers, and then conveniently and somewhat egotistically, we project these things onto nature or to an object in nature and then say, look, nature itself is like one of our little machines. Nature is like a book, the universe is like a watch, the mind is like a computer, and so on. But the fact is, I thought nature is not a watch, and the mind is not a computer. The whole process seemed crazy to me, analogy run amok, not unlike theology, perhaps. Just as we create gods in the image of humans, so we create nature in the image of our technologies. And one could perhaps go a step further, just as the Enlightenment exposed the notion of God as a human product modeled on human attributes. Perhaps I thought we need a second Enlightenment that would expose our notion of nature, or sometimes at least, as an equally human product modeled on our human technologies. Or so I thought, for a while, with a Richard Dawkins-like sense of righteousness. But the more I thought about this issue, the less tenable my initial response became, in part because of two rather impressive additional counterexamples, namely Darwin and Einstein. The first chapter of Darwin's 1859 Origin of Species is entitled Variation Under Domestication, where Darwin analyzed the ways in which agriculturalists and stock breeders had long been breeding animals and grafting plants artificially in order to select and encourage certain traits among them. Darwin began The Origin of Species with this chapter because he was presenting his own theory of natural selection as a projection of this artificial selection into nature itself. Like many others before him, Darwin was quite consciously using a technology as a means to interpret nature. As Marx said, Darwin was a philosopher of technology, but a philosopher of the natural technology of plants and animals. And something similar happens in Einstein's 1905 paper on special relativity, which begins with a reflection on the relation between two pieces of technology, a moving train and a ticking clock. Einstein writes, quote, "If I say that train arrives here at 7 o'clock, I mean something like this: the pointing of the small hand of my watch to 7 and the arrival of the train are simultaneous events," end of quote. Peter Gallison, the Harvard historian of science, who wrote a wonderful book on Einstein called Poincaré's Maps and Einstein's Clocks, points out that the special theory of relativity would have been impossible to even think in a world without clocks, just as Poincaré's topology would not have existed in a world without maps. So the two most important recent developments in the sciences, namely evolution and relativity, were at the very least dependent for their very formulation on previously developed technologies. So I had to change course in my own thinking. So there are various ways of thinking then about these examples of artifactual knowledge. It is not uncommon to say that these examples are nothing more than analogies or metaphors. The world is like a clockwork mechanism, the mind is like a computer. But since metaphor is precisely a linguistic operation, such claims only serve to highlight once again the dominance of language in philosophy. Even more frequently, we tend to think of artifacts as being, quote, applied science, or the application of a theory, as when an architect designs a house and the contractors build it. But this is simply the hylomorphic schema, the application of form to matter that Simondon famously criticized, and which again privileges episteme over technium. In the broadest sense, it is the opposite that is the case. Historically speaking, it is technology that long preceded both theory and science. So the answer, as Simondon and others have taught us, must be found elsewhere, and I would simply like to make a few quick points about how we might approach this notion of factual knowledge before I get to the second part of the paper. First, if we comprehend nature through our technologies, it is because nature is an organization of matter, and technical artifacts are the ways in which we have learned to organize matter. There is a parallel then between the operations of nature and the operations of artifacts. As Deleuze noted, the question we address to artifacts, and then he said that we should address to concepts because they're artifacts, is not what does it mean or is it true, because these are questions we address to propositions, but rather the question, how does it work? An artifact will only work if it follows the operations of nature itself. Second, Siegfried Gideon, who is an architectural historian at Yale, argued rightly, quote, that any technology makes explicit what was implicit and automatic in the process it replaces. The steam engine, for instance, harnessed the capacity of energy, in this case heated water or steam, and turned it into work, pumping a piston or turning a wheel, and in doing so it made explicit a process of nature that had remained implicit prior to the invention of the steam engine. So it's a second way of thinking about how artifacts give us knowledge. Third, in this sense, every fabricated artifact can be seen as a kind of experimental laboratory, precursors to our modern scientific laboratories. Machines are laboratories because they tend to isolate a process as a variable in order to make the artifact work. The great Canadian philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, wrote a book in 1983 entitled Representing and Intervening, which captures this aspect of artifacts. We expect statements and propositions to represent the world, but artifacts actually intervene in the operations of nature in order to make them explicit. Fourth, Simondon famously argued that the parallel between natural and technical operations can be made only if one adopts a genetic approach of individuation. And he called this putting into relation of two operations an analogical method, or more technically, and I prefer this term because analogy sounds like metaphor, more technically he called it allegmatics. So he invented a concept for this. Allegmatics is a term that's derived from the Greek verb allosein, meaning to exchange. For me, Simondon's notion of allegmatics is one of the fundamental contributions of his philosophy of technology, since it provides the outlines of a philosophical explanation of how knowledge itself can be artifactual, meaning there's an exchange between the processes of nature and the processes in artifacts, because if an artifact is working, that means it corresponds to the processes of nature itself. And then fifth, and finally, in 1710, Vico formulated what he called famously the verum factum principle, that some of you may know, which provides a pithy summary of artifactual knowledge. The verum factum principle states, we only truly understand what we are capable of making. This is what Plato called a maker's knowledge, as opposed to user's knowledge. We say we understand flight because we've actually made machines that are capable of flying. I mentioned this at the camp. Richard Feynman, the great physicist, when he died, apparently had something similar written on his chalkboard. We only understand what we can create. So these are simply quick rubrics to make the first point that I want to make today. Technical artifacts are forms of knowledge even more so than statements or propositions, precisely because they intervene in natural processes and make their operations explicit. As Vico says, we know something because we can make it. In my view, we need to revise the linguistic turn in philosophy and make an artifact turn, or a technical term, in philosophy. As the philosopher of science Mike Mahoney once said, students should not only be reading great books, they should also be examining great things, like great artifacts. I realize there's a certain personal irony in saying that, because to prepare for my presentation today, I read a lot of books, I wrote a paper, and now I'm talking about it. So it's hard to leave the linguistic paradigm behind as academics were immersed in it, and I think that's the problem. You know, we're the people who talk about things, and therefore it's easy for us to focus on language than anything outside of language, namely technicity. So there's some quick general points on artifactual knowledge. But this brings me to my second and more difficult topic, and it's the Deleuzean part of this topic. I'm suggesting that knowledge is primarily artifactual and tied to techniques rather than to being propositional. But that claim immediately raises the question of why knowledge has for so long been taken to be primarily discursive and linguistics and not technical. Heidegger wanted to recover the question of being, but he had to explain why it had been forgotten in the first place. And I feel like I'm under a similar constraint. I would not only need to give an account of the rise of discursivity and the fact that I'm being discursive at this very moment, but also to somehow show that discursivity itself, or language, is a kind of artifactual knowledge. So that's what I'm going to try to do now. And one way of stating the problem, among many others, if you think of the notion of truth in philosophy, a proposition is true if it corresponds to the world or to the nature of reality. But what philosophers don't generally ask is, what is it that separated propositions from the world in the first place so that the problem of truth became a problem at all? Like, in order for the correspondence between propositions and the world to be a problem, propositions, first of all, had to have been separated from the world in order for truth to become a problem. So that's one way of stating the problem that I want to get to here. Now, numerous scholars have suggested that the technology that turned language into an artifact and that helped separate statements and propositions from both the world and from the speaking subject was primarily, though not exclusively, the technology of writing. Now, there exists a vast literature, at least in English, on what happened in the transition from oral cultures to literate culture. The significance of writing, which is literally a technologization of language, was first explored in the 1960s by a group of thinkers working independently that included the media theorist Marshall McLuhan, the classicist Eric Havelock, the anthropologist Jack Goody, the cultural historian Walter Ong, and others, though these analyses of writing seem to have had relatively limited influence in philosophy, or at least in Anglophone philosophy. Subsequent generations have refined and expanded their revolutionary claims, particularly a guy named David Olson, who I'm going to return to in a second. What these analyses focus on in particular is the development of the technology of the phonetic alphabet, even though there were numerous types of writing that preceded phonetic writing, such as ideograms, hieroglyphs, cuneiform, and syllabaries. And even today, there are many different types of writing notations that are in use besides the alphabet, including notations in chemistry, mathematics, and music. Phonetic writing is thus an instance of what more generally might be called graphism or inscription, that is, any system of marks inscribed on a surface. Pencil marks on a paper, a chisel on stone, a stylus on a clay tablet, or even bytes on a silicon chip. That's what makes writing a technology. But all these thinkers agree that, technically speaking, there were several features that set the technology of phonetic writing apart from previous writing systems. So here's just a list of things that phonetic writing introduced. The first feature was the move toward what might be called discretization. It attempted to analyze the component parts of speech, what linguists today call phonemes, into discrete units. And these units are the 26 letters of the alphabet, which are the basic elements of speech, much like the table of elements in chemistry are the basic elements of the chemical world. Since the alphabet was relatively easy to learn, this was also a step in the democratization of writing, since writing was no longer limited to a professional class of mandarins and scribes. Second, in this way, writing was separated from what we now call art. While art, for instance, might attempt to provide a drawing of a tree, the genius of phonetic writing is that it instead provides a drawing of the word tree. Indeed, since the letters of the alphabet could be used to draw words in any language, you can draw arbre in French or Baum in German, it had a universalizing tendency. But this was possible because writing turned away from representing the world and instead represented the sounds of the speaking subject. And this is the initial answer to how writing separated language from the world. But we often forget that when we are reading, we are looking at drawings of sounds. That's essentially what a word is. Third, though phonetic writing stopped representing the world and instead represented the sounds of the speaking subject, it also externalized speech away from the speaking subject and onto a material surface. Written text, in short, became detached from both the world and the speaker or the author. Through writing, language became a detached and decontextualized object existing autonomously. Fourth, as a result, language became spatialized and visualized. Speaking is an event that unfolds in time, whereas writing turns language into an object that exists in space. Similarly, speech is oral, its medium is sound, and it's addressed to the ear, whereas writing is visual and is addressed to the eye. With writing, language became something that was seen rather than heard. Spoken utterances became visual texts. A simple example, several years ago, I was in Beijing for a few weeks and decided to take an intensive course in Mandarin. Great disaster, didn't learn very much. But in order to do this, I bought several books, a Chinese-English dictionary, a dictionary to look up Chinese characters, a book on how to write Chinese characters with the proper strokes, and then a grammar and exercise book for my class. All of which is to say, quite literally for me, the Chinese language was not simply a community of speakers that happened to live in China or in Beijing, but an objectified set of books that existed out there as an autonomous thing. So that's, now we think of language as somehow existing autonomously out there because it's externalized in these books. And then fifth, because of spatialization, one could say that writing was also an externalization of the faculty of memory. This is a common theme. In oral cultures, memories had to be retained by an individual, hence the respect accorded to elders who were literally repositories of knowledge, knowledge that would disappear when the individual died. There were no reference books, there was no way to ever look something up. In literate cultures, memory is externalized in text, which in principle can be consulted any time. And one feature of smartphones now is that they are literally handheld memory devices on which you can look up anything at any time. You can simply Google it. So this is just a short list of some of the effects that happen when language was technologized in writing, and which were analyzed by this first wave of thinkers who first thought about the relation between orality and literacy. The sound of speech was discretized, divided into discrete units or letters. These units were externalized off the body and inscribed on a material surface. As a result, speech was no longer heard, it was no longer addressed to the ear, but it became something visual, addressed to the eye. And language was spatialized. It existed in space as something independent and autonomous. Now, it's not as if writing was the only media that externalized things. Painting, sculpture, architecture, musical instruments, tool-making were all forms of externalization and forms of thought. But the importance that learning the technology of writing has taken on in our culture can hardly be overemphasized. Particularly after the invention of the printing press, being literate almost became synonymous with being civilized. The fact that all of us here in this room have devoted many years of our lives to becoming expert readers and writers tends to obscure the degree of technical sophistication that writing involves. and the fact that it is a highly complex technology. That's why most of us spent so many years trying to learn it. But now to get to the heart of what I want to say, and I'll try to move quickly. But there was also a second wave of thinkers that have carried the analysis further and in particular explored the consequences of writing for philosophy. And this really takes me to the heart of what I want to say today. Recall Siegfried Gideon's principle that, quote, any technology makes explicit what was implicit and automatic in the process it replaces. This is true of writing. It's going to make explicit features of language that remained implicit in speech. Now, David Olson, this thinker I mentioned in his book with a great title, The Mind on Paper, has taken up this theme with regard to phonetic writing. Olson has argued that just as the technology of the steam engine made explicit the laws of thermodynamics, the technology of writing made explicit the elements of language, thereby opening up a domain that philosophy, I would argue, since the Greeks, has made its own. Now, Olson isolates 4 such elements of language: letters, words, sentences, and prose. This might seem like a surprising list, and it should be, since it probably seems obvious to most of us that language is made up of letters, words, sentences. But this is Olson's argument. It was not obvious that language was made up of letters, words, and sentences until the development of writing. The technology of writing made explicit what was implicit in speech, namely that language is made up of letters, words, and sentences. Discerning letters, words, and sentences were the techniques that were required in order for us to technologize speech in writing and allow it to be inscribed on a surface. In a sense, all of those things are technological artifacts themselves. Now, to dramatize the significance of this transition from oral to written culture, I want to quickly read a story told by a man named Prince Mudube, who was born in 1901 in French West Africa, contemporary Guinea, into a culture without writing, and who related how he reacted when he realized what a book was while he was visiting the house of a local missionary. Quote, "The one crowded space in Father Perry's house was his bookshelves. I gradually came to understand that the marks on the pages were trapped words. Anyone could learn to decipher the symbols and turn the words loose again into speech. The ink of the print trapped the thoughts. They could no more get away than a dumbu, a monkey, could get out of a pit, a trap. When the full realization of what this meant flooded over me, I experienced the same thrill and amazement as when I had my first glimpse of the bright lights of Conakry, which is the capital of Guinea. I shivered with the intensity of my desire to do this wondrous thing myself." Now, I like this passage because this guy, Mudube, eventually emigrated to the US. He became a Hollywood actor and producer, and then eventually wrote his autobiography, which this is taken from. For Mudube, learning to read and write, he said, was initially a formal initiation into a new religious practice for him. Writing was a kind of magic that could trap words in a net, and reading was a technique that would set those words free again, like the breaking of a spell. We now tend to smile at such stories, but that is because everyone in this room has already literally mastered those feats of magic, to trap words on a piece of paper and then to set them free again in reading. It's become so common to us, we don't think of the magic involved. So this is my question then. What are the feats of devilry that have allowed us all to learn these tricks and to enter this new religious practice that's called writing? So I just want to go through quickly these 4 things that Olson isolates and then make some conclusions about how important this has been for philosophy. So the first answer is letters, or more precisely what linguists call phonemes. While speaking is, in a sense, a natural phenomenon that children learn without much assistance, reading and writing are highly unnatural and artificial. They both require years of technical training and practice, and as neurologists have shown, learning these techniques produces substantial changes in the physiologies of our brains. There are 2 excellent books on this topic. Reading in the Brain, The New Science of How We Read by Stanislas Dehaene, who's at the Collège de France, and Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain by Marianne Wolf at Tufts University. Forcing the brain to change is one of the reasons learning these techniques takes so long. And on top of that, they're actually brain pathologies like dyslexia and agraphia that can impair one's ability to read and write, and that did not exist prior to the formulation of the technologies of writing. So these technologies have actually introduced pathologies into the brain. The reason is that literacy brings into play numerous different linguistic, affective, and cognitive processes involving various oral, visual, and phonological skills, and problems with any one of these neurological processes can prevent some children from learning to read or write well, which is why dyslexia is actually a generic term for lots of different problems. But when it does work well, the result is what has been called the reading brain or the literate mind. It is something each of this room has inside their skull. At the base of phonetic writing is what has been called the alphabetic principle. Speech forms a continuity in which all sounds are co-articulated, with one phoneme overlapping with and dictating the pronunciation of the next. But to become literate is to understand first that speech consists of sounds that can be broken up analytically into discrete units and rearranged. And second, that these sounds can be represented by drawings, which we call letters. An alphabet is primarily a technical device for drawing pictures of the smallest segments of sound that are analyzable by the human ear. With the alphabet, sounds became explicit objects of thought. And as Dehaene stresses, phonemes and graphemes, or letters, developed in tandem in a kind of reciprocal determination. Children learn to recognize sounds at the same time they are learning to recognize letters. Reading and writing both require thus what is called phonological awareness. This is the type of explicit awareness that occurs when we ask children not to think about what they are saying, but to think about the words and sounds they are using when they think about what they are saying. We often ask children to find words that rhyme. To find words that rhyme, like cat and bat, to find words with the same ending, like wound and sound, to find homonyms, like right and right, or eight and eight, bear and bear, and so on, to find synonyms, shy and timid, to find words that begin with the same sounds, like cart and carpet. Such exercises are tasks that provoke children to become aware of the sounds of the words they are using. Developing this phonological awareness, this knowledge of the relation between letters and sounds, is what lies at the basis of the technologies of writing and reading. And as you'll see in a second, this is the start of philosophy itself. When we tell kids how to sound things out, like my favorite one, there are 119 different spellings of the single word elephant when children are asked just to sound out the word elephant and say what it sounds like, because we think phonetics is straightforward and the letters actually represent the sound of the words, but in fact that's rarely the case. And like number 3, in English at least, they're words that have the same ending, but they're pronounced completely differently. Meat, great, threat. Like same letters, but totally different pronunciation. All of which is to elucidate a principle Deleuze says about desiring machines. They work well only on the condition that they're constantly breaking down. And you can say the same thing is true about phonetics in language. It works well because it really doesn't work well at all, or at least half the time. But I'm going to skip all that. So let me go from letters now to words. Speakers of language do not generally need to be aware of words. Ordinarily, speakers think with words rather than about words. Like phonemes, the concept of a word is a literate artifact, a product of writing. In fact, rather than talking about words, linguists talk more precisely about morphemes as the basic unit of meaning, just as the phoneme is the elementary unit of sound. The word unbelievable, for instance, is made up of 3 morphemes, unbelievable. There is little consensus on defining what a word is, except that it stands alone in a dictionary, which is evidence of its artifactual nature. The fact that words are artifacts can be seen both historically and developmentally. Historically, Milman Parry, the great Homeric scholar, has shown that Homer, who was an oral poet, thought not with words, but rather with stock phrases or cliches, such as the dark wine sea, or the sturdy oak, or rosy-fingered dawn. Orators would narrate the Iliad not by memorizing it word for word, but rather by drawing on their stock of formulaic phrases or epithets. Wikipedia has an entire webpage that lists the many epithets in Homer. And when Beowulf speaks of an orator's word hoard, a nice phrase, an expression usually translated as vocabulary, is much more likely that it referred to a stock of sayings rather than single words. So in oral traditions, this is what your basic unit of speech was. It wasn't words. We think of words because we have written dictionaries, which are made up of words. In the Latin West, as Sanger has shown, words were not separated out in written text until the 11th century. Until then, manuscripts were written in scripta continua, a continuous script. Texts were meant to be read out loud, and since speech was continuous, the text was continuous. Segmenting a continuous text into discrete words was introduced much later in order to facilitate silent reading. Augustine, in a famous passage of the Confessions, recalled his astonishment in walking in on his teacher Ambrose one day, who was looking at a manuscript and reading it silently. And he literally had no clue what was going on, because up till then, when you looked at a manuscript, you simply read it out loud. Developmentally, children go through the same process. When 5- and 6-year-old children are asked for a long word, they accept the word train, because trains are long, but they reject caterpillar because caterpillars are tiny. In other words, at that age, children still lack the operational concept of word. They can think about what the word refers to, its referent, but not the word itself, what Frege would call the sense of the word. Children have to be taught to consider words as objects of thought. And even this learning goes through stages. Children can early on recognize names as words, but prepositions such as of or in are treated as separate words only when children become astute readers. Now, it is precisely the separation of words from their object, their decontextualization, that was one of the starting points for philosophy. The Oxford linguist Roy Harris has observed, quote, that literacy produces a mindset in which words are treated as context-free items with context-free meanings. As Andy Clark says, written languages minimizes contextuality. It is this extraction of words from their context that makes definition possible. This is why Socrates lies at the beginning of philosophy. By asking his what is question, which is what Socrates spent his career doing. What is courage? What is beauty? What is justice? And so on. Socrates forced his interlocutors to consider these words in a decontextualized way, detached from their usual conversational context. And Socrates' interlocutors always answer in the same way that children do. When asked about beauty, they give examples of beauty and point to the referent of the word. A beautiful woman, a beautiful sunset, a beautiful painting, and Socrates triumphs because he's asking for a definition of the word, or as Plato will say, its decontextualized idea. So thus, as Eric Havelock has argued, Socrates straddles the divide between oral and literate cultures. Though he is focused on dialogue and face-to-face conversation, his insistence on asking the what is question was a rejection of oral modes of thinking in favor of an autonomous and decontextualized discourse. And here's a concrete example, and I'm almost done. In the 1930s, the Russian psychologist A.R. Luria showed this picture of 4 objects, a log, an axe, a hammer, and a saw, to 2 groups of people, one literate and one non-literate, and asked them to identify which one of the 4 items did not belong to the group. Literate people, almost everyone in this crowd, I'm sure, almost immediately identified the log as the outlier, since the 3 other objects could be classified decontextually as tools. The non-literate people analyzed the question situationally. In other words, the one object you could not eliminate was the log, since without the log, all the other tools in the image were useless. So if they eliminated something, it would be like, well, you have a hatchet and a saw, so maybe you could just get rid of one of them and you could still split the log somehow. That's the difference between the literate mind and the non-literate mind. And the argument is the same, I'm almost done, when we turn to sentences. To the literate adult, nothing is more obvious than that one speaks in sentences, that a sentence is an expression of a complete thought, that is the smallest units of language that may be judged to be true or false. But sentences, too, are artifacts. They are no more universal than are letters or words. The concept of a sentence is a meta-linguistic concept that only becomes explicit with writing. Analytic philosophers such as Paul Grice, in his book Studies in the Ways of Words, have distinguished between the utterances of speech, speaker's meaning, and the sentences of a text, linguistic meaning. Utterances are embedded in the pragmatics of conversational discourse and are usually governed by what Grice calls a cooperative principle, which presumes that the information provided in a conversation is correct, not misleading, and relevant, and serves the general purposes of the conversation. Utterances are not necessarily sentences, and speakers frequently use incomplete or fragmentary sentences in conversation. Sentences, by contrast, are abstract linguistic objects that are only indirectly related to the actual speaking practices of persons. They are utterances that have been decontextualized by writing. Indeed, learning where to position a capital letter and where to insert a period are important techniques in learning to write that serve to define a well-formed sentence. Extracting a sentence from an utterance allows one to treat the expression as mentioned rather than used, to appeal to a distinction common among analytic philosophers, and thereby to comment on it, to take it as an explicit object of thought and reflection. Now, Roy Harris, who I mentioned, has rightly claimed that Aristotle's invention of logic was based not on oral utterances, but on an abstracted and decontextualized written sentences, and that the history of logic is a history of the increased formalization of sentences. It is not that people in oral societies were pre-logical or non-logical, as Lévi-Bruhl might have claimed. It is simply that their logic was not oriented toward an explicit concept of a sentence or statement in the way that Aristotle's logic could be. Moreover, it would be impossible to construct a long mathematical or logical proof without the support of the externalized memory provided by writing. Thus, just as the separation of words from their objects was the starting point for philosophy and the kind of definition Socrates was looking for in the very concept of an idea, so too the isolation of sentences from their use in meaningful utterances in conversation was the starting point for the study of logic and formal rationality. Now, as another example, here's another example at the level of sentences. Here's a famous problem that was posed to students by Daniel Kahneman. Some of you might know him. He won the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics, which has come to be known as the Linda problem. So this is a way of letting you feel what Grice is talking about. Here's the problem, quote, Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Question, which is more probable? 1, Linda is a bank teller, or 2, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? So 80% of the respondents chose number 2. But from a logical point of view, that's wrong. Because conversationally, you've been provided with all this information, which leads you to think that number 2 is more likely. But if you decontextualize those sentences, which is what writing does, number 1 is always going to be more likely, because if you say Linda is a bank teller, that's always going to be more probable than Linda is a bank teller plus anything else, right? Because they're decontextualized. But you get the context, and therefore you choose number 2. So this is what Kahneman made a distinction in this famous book, which was a New York Times bestseller. Some of you might know it, Thinking Fast and Slow. System 1 is our everyday conversational way of thinking. It's fast, it's intuitive, it's situational, it's everyday discourse. System 2 is slow thinking. It's rational, deliberative, logical, statistical, but it presupposes statements that have been decontextualized, taken out of the context of everyday language. So this Linda problem then, to finish, brings me to the last rubric after letters, words, and sentences, namely what I would simply call prose or autonomous discourse. By now, I hope you can see how writing provides at least an initial answer to the two problems I posed earlier, how statements were separated from the world, which generated problems of truth and reference and concepts of belief, and more generally, why the Greeks privileged episteme over techne. The technology of writing decontextualized linguistic objects, such as letters, words, and sentences, and detached them from ordinary life, producing a domain of discourse or discursivity that is both autonomous and anonymous. It is this domain of decontextualized words and sentences that philosophy took as its own. It is the domain of what is usually called rationality. To be rational is to treat both words and sentences as autonomous entities. The statements used in judgments of rationality, and also, one might add, standardized tests, which is why they're sometimes problematic, are statements that have been abstracted from the world and separated from their ordinary use. The physicist Steven Weinberg has noted that some entities posited by physicists, quote, exist only in the laboratory. And the same could perhaps be said of sentences and words. They are laboratory creations that result from lifting expressions out of their normal contextual use. So to conclude, I've had two aims in this paper. First, against the usual view in philosophy that language is the medium of thought and that knowledge is primarily expressed in propositions, I've tried to make the case that we think nature, we think ourselves, our minds and our bodies through technical artifacts and not simply through propositions, as when we think of the universe as a clockwork mechanism or the mind as a kind of computer or information processor. But now in the second part of the paper, I tried to give an account of why philosophy took language and discursivity as its own domain and not technicity. And the paradoxical response is that this autonomous domain of discursivity was itself produced, in part at least, by a technology, namely the technology of writing, which allows words and sentences to become autonomous entities separated from their context, separated from the world, separated from the speaking subject. Wittgenstein famously wrote that philosophical problems arise when language goes on a holiday. Famous line from Wittgenstein. But I would suggest that what Wittgenstein did not quite see clearly is that what makes language go on a holiday, what takes it offline, as it were, what makes the engine idle, to use another one of his phrases, was the technology of writing. And I would suggest that philosophy did not, and still does not, see clearly that it is the production of this autonomous domain of rationality that is based on technicity. So let me say that again, because it's sort of summarizing what I'm trying to say. Rationality finds its ground in technicity. This autonomous domain of discourse, it's itself a technical product. So the answer to the question posed in my title, is knowledge artifactual, is obviously yes. And I can imagine future philosophers replacing, or at least supplementing, Kant's table of judgments, from which he derived his categories, with a table of artifacts, from which we derive many of our concepts. What I've put on the slide is simply a list of some of the artifacts I've mentioned today, and I focus primarily on the technology of writing. But the fact is that artifacts presuppose each other, produce each other, work upon each other in a web of interdependence that is now practically coextensive with the global human ecology. The writer Kevin Kelly has coined the term technium to describe this global network of interlocked artifacts. And if knowledge is indeed artifactual, then the technium is the integral of our knowledge, and indeed should be analyzed in such. And this is why I think this question is not simply a topic in the philosophy of technology, but ultimately has the potential to reorient the nature of philosophy as a whole, away from sort of the linguistic turn to what I think should perhaps be an artifactual term or a technical term, or at least that's what I'm trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. much, Professor Smith. This is really enlightening and fascinating talk about the genealogy of technologization of knowledge, which really brings me to reflect on my own experiences of learning English, quite painfully. So in any case, if I'm speaking anything wrong, that's because my brain was damaged in the process of learning. But anyway, just joking aside, I think we don't have that much time left, but we'll have about 5 to 10, I don't know if we can go over time, but at least 5 minutes for some interlocution. So I think one hand is raising over there, so can we have that gentleman speak to the microphone? Right over there, in the center.
So thank you very much for the wonderful talk. It was really inspiring. But I want to challenge you about two of your basic assumptions in the first part. So first of all, about Darwin, when he talked, he set the natural selection on the basis of the domestic selection of human beings. But one of the things that I think is less pronounced in his book is the notion of genetic drift that is essential for our current understanding of evolution, which means that the relationship between technology and between knowledge is a little bit more complicated than setting one over the other. Related to this is your notion about when you refer to what Vico said, that we understand only what we make. So I was involved for many years in the attempt to create synthetic cell, and over there, this notion of what we understand only what we make is really prevalent. So people always say that we want to create synthetic cell in order to understand them, how cells works. I was always suspicious of it. And especially now, because now when we are talking about language, in the large language models, the whole understanding of, the current understanding of large language model is based on the fact that we are going to create AI system that we cannot understand them, even though we created them. So how does this reflection between so maybe what Vico said was only related to the fact that the machine that existed at his time were relatively simple so that we can understand them. And therefore we can reflect them on nature.
So on Vico, I mean, you're right, it's curious with Vico because he formulated that principle because he was referring not to nature but to what we now call sociology. Because he thought, what is that we create? We create society. And since we create society, we can understand society because we're the fabricators of society. But we haven't created nature. So we can't actually understand nature because nature is a fabrication of God. And that's in part the notion of God as a creator. It's a fabricator. It's God's the technician. So already Vico was not quite saying we understand nature through our machines. He was saying we don't understand nature because we didn't make it. We understand society, which is somewhat interesting because now a lot of us say, well, you know, if you understood society, you could understand the stock market and invest and make millions of dollars. But in fact, we can't predict the stock market. And there are lots of things. We don't know where the American election is going to go. So we don't really understand it the way Vico thought we could. So it's complicated, and you know, going through things quickly here. And I totally agree with where evolution and genetics has gone. My only point in referring to Darwin is that he himself explains his you know, where he gets the idea of natural selection from his observations about artificial selection. And then, of course, there's a whole history of where evolutionary science and genetics goes after that, which I agree goes in much different domains. And as Ian pointed out earlier at camp, like there's a introduction of stupidity here in the sense that once we have certain models that come from machines, like the mechanistic view of the world, it tends to cut off other ways of of thinking about the world until some other model comes along. So it helps us understand things maybe because we see things from the inside. I think that's the point of why technology is important. We understand these artifacts from the inside because we made them. And therefore, we have an understanding of them that's different from nature, and we use it to understand nature. But it also cuts off a lot of alternate understandings, which is a kind of stupidity that perhaps gets introduced into thinking because of these artifacts. So it's not an adequate response, but thank you. And the bell is ringing. So thank you very much.
Well, I guess we'll have to wrap it up right here, given the time limits. So should we thank Professor Smith one more time?